So before we start reading Shakespeare, we need to have a basic understanding of his language. So that way, when we are reading the play, we can better interpret what he is saying. So there's three basic ways to understand Shakespeare's language. First is his unusual structure. He structures his words, his sentences, and uses his language differently than we do now. So the first thing we need to look at, and the most important, is the actual structure and how he is using the language. The second thing we're going to look at is his use of figurative language. Shakespeare loved figurative language because this was meant to be a performance, and so he had to paint the picture for people. The last thing we're going to look at is his archaic word choice. So it should not be a shock to anyone, but language meanings and usage change over time. And that's what the last thing we have to focus on. So our first thing we're going to focus on with structure is our focus on punctuation. Throughout most of Shakespeare, the meaning doesn't end at the end of the line. Most actual thoughts are enjambed. We'll talk about that later. But basically it means that when you hit a semicolon or a period, that's the point where you stop or pause, and only give brief pauses for commas. So I talked about enjambment. Enjambed lines are also known as run-on lines because the meaning of the line continues from one line to the next. There's no actual punctuation at the end of the line, or if there is, it's at most a comma, which would indicate just a breath, not an actual stop or an actual pause. So as we're reading Shakespeare, I want you to think about as you're reading, is this line enjambed, i.e., does it run on? If it runs on, if there's no punctuation at the end of that line, then your thought process has to continue on to the next line as well. The other form of line are end-stopped lines, and end-stopped lines are exactly what they sound like. There's a punctuation at the end of the line, and that means that the meaning stops at the end of the line. When we say punctuation, what we're meaning here is that there is a period or a semicolon, some kind of hard punctuation that stops and makes us think about what has just been said in that line. So let's look at some examples. This is part of a poem called Latitudes by the poet Yusuf Komunyakaa. If I am not Ulysses, I am his dear, ruthless half-brother. Strap me to the mast so that I might endure night sirens singing my birth when water broke into 1,000 blossoms in a landlocked town of the south, before my name was heard in the womb-shaped world of deep sonorous waters. So if we look at the second line, it is end-stopped. It has a period. These next series of lines, so lines 3, 4, 5, and 6, are all enjambed, or an example of enjambment, because the meaning runs from one line to the next. There's no hard punctuation there. We get a little difficult here because there's a comma, and so we have to stop and consider, is this part end-stopped or enjambed? The second part of structure that we need to look for are pairs. Shakespeare wrote in what are called couplets frequently. Couplets are rhymed pairs of lines that signal either the end of a scene or that there is some kind of connection between two characters or two thoughts. These are going to be what you think of when you think of poetry. The last words in the line are going to rhyme with each other. The third part of structure that we have to think about is that we have to reword some of his inverted sentences. Modern English puts the subject of the sentence, usually a noun performing the action, first. Not so in Shakespearean writing. Shakespeare often puts the verb first, since this was a play, and the spoken action needed to match the physical one being performed. So as we are reading it, and sometimes acting it out, what we need to do is mentally flip the wording of the sentence, find the noun, find the subject, move it to the front, and in our minds, retranslate what's going on. The fourth part of what we need to consider is called blank verse. Blank verse is the majority of what Shakespeare was written in. Blank verse is poetry with a strict rhythm or meter, but no set rhyme scheme. The majority of Shakespeare's plays are written in this blank verse. Now, blank verse can come in a variety of different meters, but let's look at an example here. Blank verse is used because it most closely mimics the structure of natural speech, while still allowing the author to apply an overall structure to the poem or to the play, in our case. This example shows how blank verse works in a monologue from Christopher Marlowe's play Faustus. In it, we can see that the blank verse isn't always strict, as the first line only has 9 beats or 9 syllables, since the first unstressed syllable has been dropped. Also, the fifth line has 3 stressed syllables in a row that allows an emphasis on the rise, rise again. However, the majority of the lines have 10 syllables, but there's no ending rhyme scheme. Now, Shakespeare uses a specific form of blank verse, which is called iambic pentameter. An iamb is a 2-syllable combination. In strict poetry terms, they're called feet, made up of 1 unstressed and 1 stressed syllable. So think of a heartbeat, the bump, 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 or the pattern of short, long. You can think about the words above, destroy, or inspire. When identified with the number of feet or the number of syllables in a line, the meter, which we'll talk about next, it's referred to as iambic. So in iambic pentameter, penta means 5. So iambic pentameter, which is what Shakespeare writes in, means that there are 10 syllables per line with that heartbeat iambic rhythm. There are 5 sets of 2. That's where you get your iambic pentameter. Shakespeare wrote this way to mimic that heartbeat feeling and to mimic that natural speech pattern, which would make it easier for his actors to memorize all of their lines. All right, we're going to move on to figurative language. So almost everything Shakespeare writes is figurative language. Metaphors abound. So do personification, irony, puns, and imagery. Remember, these were meant to be seen and heard, not read. So Shakespeare used a multitude of figurative language to paint a picture for his mostly illiterate audience. Shakespeare also loved to use allusions, especially to Greek and Roman mythology. Often these allusions help you understand what the character is trying to convey, so not getting the reference can sometimes hinder your understanding. However, don't get too caught up on trying to reference every single allusion in the play. There are way too many, and you'll just get bogged down in all of the kind of minute details. The last part that we're going to look at is Shakespeare's archaic diction. In order to maintain his blank verse, that unrhymed iambic pentameter rhythm, Shakespeare had to omit unnecessary syllables at times, and these are just some of the most common. So instead of spending 2 syllables saying it is, he shortened it into tis. Instead of spending 2 syllables on open, he'll shorten it to ope. The same thing with over, he'll shorten it to or. Never ever become ne'er and ere. In, which is already only 1 syllable, he shortens to I apostrophe because he then attaches that to the next word, and so he basically gets rid of the syllable used in the word in altogether. Often, even are the same way. They get shortened to 1 syllable, oft, in. Be it, on it, do it, often get shortened to be it, on't, do't. And with becomes with. Again, it gets attached just like in. Against, they just take off the A and say gainst. Taken becomes ta'en. It will becomes twill. Know it becomes knowst. And of becomes o. The last part of archaic diction that we need to look at is his slang. So, shocker, words change over time. Words have changed just within our lifetimes, so it shouldn't really be a surprise that 400 years after Shakespeare has written his language, the meanings have changed, or perhaps the words have disappeared altogether. So these are, again, some of the most common slang terms. Anon means right now. So when people say that they will come anon, it means, okay, I'm coming, chill. Art means are. Dost or doth is Shakespearean or King James English for does or do. Ere means before. So if you say, I will be there ere long, it means you'll be there before long. Hark means listen. Hither and thither, those are fairly common. They represent here and there. Hath means has. This is a weird one. The word marry does not mean that you are connecting 2 people in a marriage. It does not even mean that you're happy. Marry means listen or wait. And people would have used it honestly in the same way that we use the word like now. It's kind of that mental pause. Pray or prithee, it's a shortening of pray thee, basically just means please. So if a character says pray you, they're not asking that character to go to church. They're asking that character to please do something. Sirrah basically just means hey you or mister. It's actually kind of a derogatory term. They used it for servants and people who they didn't really care about. Sooth means in fact. It comes from the word to tell the truth. So if a character says in sooth, they're meaning in fact, this is what happened. Whence, again, comes from the word where, so it means from where have you come. Oddly, the word wherefore has no connection to the word where at all. Wherefore actually means why. And would, again, does not have the same meaning that we have now. Would means that you wish. So if a character says, I would that you had blah, 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 it means that you wish they had done something. So now that we've looked at these three main points and all of these subpoints about how to understand Shakespearean language, hopefully reading Shakespeare will not be as difficult a task as it would have been. And as always, remember to cite your sources.